Thanks for having me. So I'm an Egyptologist, which means that I work on the ancient cultures of what is today Egypt. Although many Egyptologists also work on ancient cultures to the south of Egypt, so in what is today Sudan. So I think of these as ancient Nile Valley cultures because at that time, of course, the modern borders that we think of as Egypt and Sudan don't apply to those ancient cultures. So I work in the field of ancient Nile Valley studies. And I came to this field of study actually through an interest in Islamic studies and the modern country of Egypt, and in going to Egypt to learn how to speak Arabic a little bit better and to understand that culture. That was my introduction to the ancient world of the Nile Valley.
That's very interesting. So you are originally from Philadelphia. Can you say a few? I know that the time that we have is pretty limited, but it's okay. We still care about you, your story. In fact, if you read on that, everyone has a story to share. So despite the fact that we might pay attention to everything that you are going to say, but we care about you as a person. So tell me a little bit about yourself, where you were born and where you grew up. Tell me about that, please.
Sure. So I was born and grew up in the state of Pennsylvania, but not in the city of Philadelphia. I live in Philadelphia now, which is a great city. I grew up in a very, very small town, population about 3,000, in the north central part of Pennsylvania. And my heritage is that my father is from London. He was born and raised in England, and he came to the United States as a young man. He was transferred here for business reasons. And he met my mother in this country. My mother is of Lebanese heritage. So I am, I suppose one would say, like half English, half Lebanese, if we're talking in modern nation state language.
All right. Now, growing up in Philadelphia, no, you didn't grow up in Philadelphia. I don't know if I get that correct. But anyway, what I'm interested in is that growing up as a young woman in the U.S., what was the thing that you see around you in terms of because I want to believe that there are something that made you build and want to choose history and to have curiosity in learning about history, which is what you are doing today. But I'm trying to understand how that even came about. Is it by accident or is it by intention? Was it because your parent made you to do that? So help me understand that you are still much younger now.
It's an interesting question. I think for me, I became interested in history probably because my father was interested in history and talked to me a lot about it when I was growing up. And his interest, his knowledge, of course, was strongest about English history, since that's where he was born and raised. And he taught me about, the ancient history of that island and, the more recent history. And he used to play a game with me. We had a big globe and he would spin it around and like stop it. And I would have to name the country and name the capital or maybe name some rivers in it. And so he got me very interested in geography and history. And I think that combined with the fact that my mother has Lebanese heritage and she was raised speaking Arabic, although she didn't teach us, her children, Arabic. So that made me really want to learn Arabic and made me want to understand Lebanese culture better. So I think all of those things combined made me interested in history.
Okay, now you got rooted so much in ancient history. Of course, this is also very important now because if we want to know where we are going, we must know where we are coming from. So, give me sort of what interests you about Egyptian history, the ancient Kemet history. What is the thing that actually interests? Of course, Egypt, ancient Kemet are not the only ancient people in the world, but you decide to focus on this. There must be a reason for that. What is the reason?
The reason has a lot to do with the fact that I visited Egypt as a young person. So when I was studying Arabic in college, I was encouraged to go to a country where Arabic was the predominant language so that I could be living and speaking Arabic every day. And I chose Egypt. So I did a study abroad course in Egypt. And this I was living in Egypt. I mean, I came from this tiny small town and I was living in Cairo, which is a huge city. And I fell in love with it. I fell in love with Egypt. I fell in love with Cairo. And that was my first introduction to the ancient history of that area. And I became fascinated with that as well. And so I was continuing my studies in Islamic studies and training myself in archaeology, which at that time you couldn't train in Egypt. When you were learning archaeology, you had to learn it elsewhere. And so I was doing archaeological training elsewhere, but I would always go back to Egypt and travel around and visit and sort of educate myself on those ancient cultures. So I would say that I came to be fascinated with the ancient history of the Nile Valley through repeated visits to the modern area and, meeting the people who live there and just very much feeling in tune with that area.
All right. In terms of the preparation, what do you have to do? Okay, now, but this is general now. How do people need to prepare as an archaeologist? Because you say you didn't need to do this study in Egypt, but of course you need to go there from time to time. And so, in terms of this preparation, take me there a little bit. What do you have to do in preparing yourself?
Well, there's different ways to prepare oneself. A lot of people I know do reading and self-study. Of course, now there are all sorts of courses and lectures online that weren't available when I was a young person. If you literally want to get training in the field of archaeology, there are places in the US that you can do that. And that experience is very good and very important to just learn the skills that you need in the field. And that transfers well no matter where you go to dig after you gain those initial skills.
All right. Some of these skills will include what?
Well, there's knowing how to dig, for one thing, in a way that is not going to disturb the layers under where you're digging. So it's like you can't just sort of take a shovel and start digging dirt. You have to, there's special tools, you have to move carefully, you have to move at certain required levels. So like, let's say whatever your dig director has determined, we're going to go this far on this layer. You need to be sure you go that far and not that far. Drawing and mapping are an important part of archaeology. You typically will be taking photographs as well. There's observation, there's understanding what you're going to find on the dig. So before you go to the dig, you might be educated, say, in the ceramic tradition of the area where you're digging, so that when you find ceramics, you understand what it is you're looking at. Or you might look at stone structures of the culture that you're excavating, so that when you find rocks in a certain pattern, you understand what that stone structure may have been.
Mhm. This kind of work, is it something that you are particularly interested in? Is it something that motivates you to work, since you have to do a lot of digging and all that? How passionate is it for you as a career, as a job?
So I enjoy archaeology, but I have not worked as an archaeologist for a long time. I did my early training in archaeology, and then I did later training in language and art. And now the work that I'm doing, that I'm very passionate about, is making connections between those ancient cultures and more modern scholars, so early 20th century scholars. So I work particularly on scholars of African descent in the US in the early 20th century, and how they were engaging with these ancient cultures and engaging with the academic disciplines that were studying those ancient cultures. So very early Egyptology. Egyptology is a fairly young discipline in the grand history of the university. So in the early 20th century, there were only a couple of Egyptologists in the United States at that time in universities. And so these scholars of African descent were engaging with those Egyptologists, they were engaging with Egyptologists elsewhere in the world, and they were really reading histories and understanding what we knew about those ancient cultures at that time.